I used to believe that death was the worst thing that could happen to a man, until the day I heard someone beg for it and wasn't granted the mercy. Until I saw what the Imperium truly does to those it cannot kill, and until I understood that in this galaxy, suffering is not an accident, it is a resource. The black ships came without warning, their shadows swallowing our sky like a slow-moving eclipse, and even before their engines silenced the winds, we knew something had gone terribly wrong, because no one celebrates when those ships arrive, no one waves, no one prays. They hide, they tremble, they wait to be taken. I remember the sound, first the low, bone-shaking hum that seemed to vibrate inside my skull, like something alive was listening to my thoughts, measuring them, weighing my soul before I even understood I had already been judged. And then came the soldiers, faceless behind their helmets, moving with mechanical purpose as they dragged people from their homes, ignoring the screams, ignoring the pleas, ignoring the children clutching at their parents as if their small hands could somehow anchor them to safety. I tried to run, of course I did. Anyone would. But there is no running from something that has already decided your fate. And when their gauntlet hand closed around my arm, it didn't feel like being captured, it felt like being claimed. They never told us why we were chosen, never explained what we had done or what we were going to become, only that we were needed. And in the Imperium, being needed is often far worse than being forgotten. They packed us into the hold like cargo, shoulder to shoulder, breath mixing with panic as the doors sealed shut with a finality that echoed louder than any scream. And in that darkness, something shifted, not just fear, but realization, because there were no guards watching us inside, no restraints, no chains, as if escape was not even a possibility worth preventing. That was when the first man started whispering, over and over again, his voice cracking as if he had already seen what awaited us, repeating a single phrase like a broken prayer. Don't let them take your mind. Don't let them take your mind. And before anyone could stop him, before anyone could even understand what he meant, he slammed his head against the metal wall again and again until the sound became wet and hollow, until his body slid to the floor and did not move again. And in that moment, no one tried to help him, because for the first time, we all understood that he might have just chosen the better fate. The journey lasted days, or maybe weeks. Time stopped meaning anything in that suffocating dark, but eventually the doors opened, and what greeted us was not relief, but a colder, deeper kind of dread, because the place we had arrived at did not feel like a facility, or a prison, or even a world. It felt like a grave that had never been meant for the dead. The air itself was wrong, thick and metallic, carrying a scent that I would later recognize as something far worse than decay, and the walls stretched impossibly high, carved with symbols that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them, as if reality itself was struggling to remain intact in that place. They marched us forward without a word, deeper into the structure, past rows of silent figures who did not react to our presence, their eyes hollow, their bodies still, as if something inside them had already been taken and whatever remained was simply waiting for the rest to be removed. That was when I saw the machines. I don't have words for them, not truly, because they were not designed for anything a sane mind could comprehend. Towering constructs of metal and flesh, pulsing with a rhythm that felt disturbingly alive. Their surfaces crawling with cables that disappeared into the bodies of those unfortunate enough to be connected to them, and those bodies, Emperor forgive me, those bodies were still breathing. I remember locking eyes with one of them, a man, or what used to be a man, his face stretched into something that might have once been a scream, but had long since lost the strength to make sound, his eyes begging, not for help, but for an end. And that was when I realized the truth that would haunt every moment that followed. Whatever this place was, it did not kill you, it kept you. We were separated after that, dragged into different corridors as the whispers began again, louder this time, not from the people around me, but from the walls themselves, faint, almost impossible to hear, like echoes trapped between dimensions, and I could feel something pressing against my thoughts, probing, searching, as if it was peeling back the layers of my mind one by one, looking for something I didn't even know I possessed. I tried to resist, tried to hold on to anything that felt like memories, names, faces, but they slipped away too easily, like sand through fingers that were already losing their grip. And when they strapped me into the chair, I didn't fight anymore, because deep down, I think I already knew that it wouldn't matter. The metal restraints closed around my limbs with surgical precision, cold and unyielding, and the machine above me descended slowly, almost gently, as if it understood the importance of this moment, as if it was savoring it. And then I heard a voice nod from outside, but inside my own head. Ancient and utterly devoid of empathy, speaking words that did not need to be understood to be feared. You will serve. And then the pain began. Not the kind of pain that makes you scream, not the kind that overwhelms and consumes until there is nothing left but agony. No, this was something far worse, something precise, something controlled, as if every nerve in my body was being studied, catalogued, and then rewritten. And I realized with growing horror that they were not trying to break me, they were trying to preserve me, to keep me conscious, aware, intact, because whatever they were turning me into, it required me to remember what I used to be. I don't know how long it lasted, I don't know how much of me was taken or how much was left behind, but at some point, the pain stopped, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than anything that had come before, because in that silence, I could feel it, the absence, something essential, something fundamental, something that had defined who I was gone, and yet, I was still alive. The restraints released, and I collapsed to the floor, my body refusing to respond the way it used to, my thoughts moving slower, heavier, as if they no longer fully belonged to me, and when I looked up, I saw the others, those who had gone through the same process, standing in perfect stillness, their faces empty, their eyes devoid of fear, of pain, of anything at all, and I understood then that this was not the end, it was the beginning, because death would have been mercy, death would have been escape, but this was something far more cruel. This was existence without self, service without will, eternity without meaning. And as they lifted me back onto my feet, guiding me toward whatever awaited next, I felt the last fragment of who I had been slipping away, and for the first time in my life, I wanted to die. I thought the worst had already happened to me. I was wrong, horribly wrong, because what they did to my body was nothing compared to what awaited my mind. And as they forced me to stand among the others, those hollow, silent figures who no longer remembered what it meant to be human, I began to notice something far more disturbing than the machines, far more terrifying than the pain. The silence inside my own thoughts was not empty, it was occupied. At first it was subtle, like a faint echo that didn't belong to me, a second layer beneath my own consciousness, watching, waiting, breathing, in sync with my fear, and I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just a side effect of whatever they had done. But the longer I stood there, the stronger it became, pressing against my mind like something trying to push its way through a thin barrier, testing its limits, learning my weaknesses, and then, it spoke, not with words, not with language, but with intent, with emotion so raw and overwhelming that it bypassed thought entirely and burrowed directly into my soul. And what it showed me in that instant was enough to shatter whatever fragile sanity I had left. I saw a place beyond reality, a storm of impossible colors and shifting shapes, where the laws of existence twisted and broke like fragile glass, where time did not flow but coiled and collapsed into itself, and within that chaos I felt presences vast, ancient, and hungry. I watched not just me, but everything, as if the entire universe was nothing more than a source of endless sustenance for their insatiable hunger. I tried to look away, tried to pull my mind back into my own body, but it was already too late, because once you glimpse that place, it never truly lets you go. The voice, if I can even call it that, grew clearer, more focused, shaping itself around my thoughts as if it was learning how to speak through me, and it whispered a truth that I wish I had never understood: you are already ours. My body moved before I could react, my legs carrying me forward in perfect synchronization with the others, as if some unseen force was guiding us, and I realized with a cold, sinking dread that I was no longer fully in control, that every step I took was not entirely my own, and yet I was still aware, still conscious, still trapped inside myself as something else began to take hold. They led us into another chamber, deeper, darker, where the walls seemed to pulse like living tissue, and the air itself felt thick with something unseen, something that pressed against my skin and seeped into my lungs with every breath. And in the center of that chamber stood a figure unlike anything I had ever seen, tall-robed, its face hidden beneath layers of shadow, but its presence was unbearable, like standing too close to a star that burned not with light, but with something far more sinister. I didn't need to be told what it was, because the thing inside my mind recoiled for just a moment, not in fear, but in recognition. This was no ordinary servant of the Imperium. This was something that stood at the edge of humanity and the abyss beyond, something that wielded powers no sane being should ever possess. And as it raised its hand, I felt the barrier inside my mind begin to crack. One by one, the others stepped forward, their movements mechanical, obedient, and as each of them reached the figure, they simply stopped, their bodies freezing in place as the air around them twisted and warped, and then they began to change. I watched in horror as their forms distorted, not physically at first, but something deeper, something fundamental, as if their very essence was being pulled apart and reshaped into something new, something wrong, and the worst part, they were still aware. I could feel it, through whatever connection had been forced into my mind. I could feel their terror, their confusion, their desperate attempts to hold on to who they were, and I could feel it slipping away. When it was my turn, I wanted to resist. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything that might stop what was about to happen, but my body betrayed me, stepping forward without hesitation, without permission, and as I stood before that figure, I felt its attention fall upon me, heavy and suffocating, as if it was peeling back every layer of my existence and examining what lay beneath. "Interesting," it said, and this time, the voice was real, echoing through the chamber with a calm, detached curiosity that made it all the more terrifying. "This one still clings to itself." I tried to speak, tried to beg, but no sound came out, because the moment it touched my mind, everything else ceased to matter. It was not like before, not like the whispers or the visions. This was direct, invasive, absolute, and I felt my thoughts being torn open, my memories laid bare, every moment of my life exposed and analyzed in an instant, and then it began to take them, not all at once, not violently, but carefully, selectively, as if it was choosing which parts of me to keep and which to discard. And I realized with growing horror that it was not trying to destroy me, it was trying to refine me. The presence inside my mind surged forward, no longer subtle, no longer hidden, merging with the process in a way that made my entire being feel like it was being stretched between two opposing forces, one cold and methodical, the other wild and insatiable. And in that moment I understood the true nature of my fate. I was not being turned into a tool. I was being turned into a bridge between this world and something far worse. The pain returned then, but it was different this time, deeper, more existential, as if it was not my body that was suffering, but my very identity, my sense of self unraveling thread by thread, and I could feel it happening. Feel the exact moment when a memory faded, when a part of who I was simply ceased to exist, replaced by something alien, something that did not belong to me, and yet was now a part of me, whether I wanted it or not. I saw flashes of things I could not comprehend in this battlefield drenched in blood, towering entities made of pure emotion, entire civilizations rising and falling in the span of a heartbeat, and through it all, that voice remained, constant, patient, guiding the process as if it had done this countless times before. "Do not resist," it said, not unkindly, but with an absolute certainty that made resistance feel pointless. "You will serve a greater purpose." And that was the moment I finally understood. This was not a punishment. This was not even cruelty for its own sake. This was efficiency. In this universe, nothing is wasted, not pain, not fear, not even the human soul. Everything is used, repurposed, transformed into something that serves the endless, grinding machine of existence, and I had just become a part of it. When it was over, I did not collapse like before. I did not scream or cry or beg, because those parts of me were gone now, stripped away and replaced with something quieter, something colder. And as I stood there, looking out at the others who had undergone the same transformation, I realized that we were no longer prisoners. We were something else entirely, something that did not need chains, something that did not need orders, because whatever we had become, we had already been broken in the only way that mattered. And as the chamber doors opened, revealing a path that led not back into the world we once knew, but into something far darker, I took my first step forward without hesitation, without fear, and without any memory of why I should have been afraid in the first place. But somewhere, deep beneath the layers of what I had become, a single thought remained, faint and distant, like an echo of a life that no longer existed, and it whispered a truth I could no longer fully understand. "This is worse than death." I do not remember when we crossed the threshold, only that there was a moment, brief, fragile, almost gentle, when reality itself seemed to hesitate, as if even the universe was uncertain whether we should be allowed to continue. And then it broke, not shattered like glass, not torn like fabric, but unmade, as though the rules that once governed existence simply stopped applying, and we stepped into something that was never meant to be understood by minds like ours. The aurora, what I still perceived as air, thickened into something alive, pressing against my skin with a suffocating intimacy. And the silence that followed was not empty, but deafening, filled with a constant, shifting noise that had no source, no pattern, no meaning, and yet carried a weight that made my thoughts feel small, insignificant, like whispers lost in a storm that had been raging long before I existed. This was the warp, though even that word feels inadequate, a poor attempt to label something that exists beyond language, beyond comprehension, beyond sanity itself. I could feel it immediately, not just around me, but inside me, threading through whatever remained of my consciousness, weaving itself into my being, as if it had always been there, waiting for this moment to reveal its true form. The others moved with me, or perhaps I moved with them. It was impossible to tell anymore, all forms flickering at the edges of perception. Not entirely stable, not entirely real, as though we were no longer bound to a single shape, a single identity, a single truth. I looked down at my hands, or what I thought were my hands, and for a moment they appeared normal, flesh and bone, familiar and reassuring. And then they weren't. They stretched, elongated, split into multiple versions of themselves, each one slightly different, each one existing simultaneously, overlapping and contradicting one another in ways that made my mind recoil. And yet, I did not panic. I could not bet. That part of me had been taken, stripped away like everything else that once made me human, leaving behind only observation, only awareness, only the quiet acceptance of what I was becoming. The path ahead twisted and shifted, not physically, but conceptually, as if direction itself had lost meaning, and we followed it not because we understood where it led, but because something within us compelled us to move forward, to descend deeper into a place where even the idea of down no longer applied. That was when I began to see them. At first they were just shapes at the edge of perception, silhouettes that flickered in and out of existence, too large, too vast, too wrong to be fully perceived, and every instinct that remained within me, every fragmented echo of fear and survival screamed that I should not look at them, that I should keep my gaze fixed ahead and pretend they did not exist. But something stronger, something imposed, forced me to acknowledge them. And when I did, they noticed. I cannot describe what they looked like, not truly, because their forms defied consistency, shifting between states that contradicted one another, one moment towering and incomprehensible, the next impossibly small and intimately close, their presence folding space around them in ways that made distance meaningless, and yet I could feel their attention as clearly as if they were standing directly in front of me, studying me, tasting the remnants of my soul as if it was something tangible, something consumable. There was no malice in them, and that was the most horrifying part. They were not evil, not in any way a human mind could define. They simply were, existing beyond concepts like morality or intent, driven by instincts and desires so vast and alien that trying to understand them was like trying to comprehend infinity itself. One of them reached toward me, or perhaps I moved toward it. For a moment, everything stopped, not just my body, not just my thoughts, but everything, as if time itself had been paused, suspended in a single, infinite instant, and in that instant, I felt it touch me, not physically, not even mentally, but something deeper, something fundamental, and as it did, I saw lifetimes countless, overlapping, contradictory, each one a version of existence that could have been, should have been, might still be, or collapsing into one another in a cascade of possibility that had no beginning and no end, and within those lifetimes I saw myself, or what I could have been, what I might become, what I already was in some distant, impossible sense. I saw myself as a warrior, clad in armor that felt like a second skin, fighting battles that stretched across centuries, driven by a purpose I no longer understood. I saw myself as something else entirely, something inhuman, something that had long since abandoned any connection to the life I once knew, existing only to serve a will that was not my own. And then, I saw the truth. I saw what I was becoming here, in this place, in this moment. And it was not a transformation, not a change, but a revelation. This was not something being done to me. This was something that had always been waiting within me, something that the Imperium had merely uncovered, refined, and delivered to its final destination. The entity withdrew. Perhaps I was the one who pulled away on the world, or whatever passed for a world here rushed back into motion. The noise returning, the pressure intensifying, the path unfolding once more before us, and yet, something had changed. Not around me, but within me. The presence that had once felt foreign, invasive, had now settled into something more stable, more integrated, no longer a separate voice, but a part of my own thoughts, indistinguishable from what remained of my original self. And I realized with a cold, distant clarity that there was no longer a line between what I was and what I had become. We continued forward, deeper into the warp, and the entities faded from immediate view, though I could still feel them, always watching, always present, like gods that had no need for worship, only existence. And eventually, we reached something that resembled a destination. It was not a place, not in any conventional sense, but a convergence, a point where countless threads of reality or unreality intersected, forming something that almost resembled structure, almost resembled purpose, and at its center was a presence unlike the others. This one did not merely observe. This one commanded. Its form, or the closest approximation my mind could construct, was vast beyond comprehension, a storm of shifting energy and impossible geometry, radiating a sense of authority that dwarfed everything around it. And as we approached, I felt something stir within me, not fear, not resistance, but recognition. This was what we had been brought here for. This was the purpose that had been carved into what remained of our existence. We were not prisoners, we were not victims, we were offerings. The realization did not come with panic, did not trigger any desperate attempt to escape, because those parts of me no longer existed. And as we moved closer, I felt myself unraveling once more, not painfully, not violently, but inevitably, like a story reaching its final page, like a life concluding not with a scream, but with a quiet, irreversible acceptance. And yet, somewhere, buried beneath everything I had become, there was still something left. Fragment, a whisper, a memory that refused to fully disappear, and as I stood on the edge of whatever came next, I felt it stir for the first time since this nightmare began, a faint, desperate echo of the person I used to be, and it asked a question that I could no longer answer. Was this fate? Or was this always who I was meant to become? There is a moment, just before something ends, when time seems too slow not to give you a chance to escape, not to offer mercy, but to ensure that you understand exactly what is being taken from you. And as I stood before that vast, incomprehensible presence, I felt that moment stretching into something eternal, something inescapable, something that allowed me perhaps for the last time to truly see myself, not as I was now, not as the hollow vessel I had become, but as I once had been, a person with a name, with memories, with a life that had meaning, however small, however insignificant it may have been in the grand scale of this unforgiving universe. And for a fleeting instant, that memory returned with painful clarity, the warmth of a sun I could no longer feel, the sound of voices I could no longer recognize, the simple, fragile certainty that I existed as something whole, something complete. And then, it began to fade. Not violently, not suddenly, but gently, almost kindly, like a hand closing over a candle flame, extinguishing it not out of cruelty, but out of inevitability. The presence before me shifted, its form collapsing and expanding in ways that defied all logic, and yet I could feel its focus narrowing, centering entirely on me, as if among all the countless souls that had been brought to this place, I was the one it had chosen. Not for any reason I could understand, not because I was special or unique, but because in a universe like this, selection does not require purpose, only opportunity. The others had already begun their transformation, their forms dissolving into streams of energy that flowed toward the entity like rivers feeding into an endless ocean. Their identities erased without resistance, without hesitation, because there was nothing left within them to resist with. But I was different, not stronger, not more worthy, but incomplete. There was still something within me that had not fully surrendered, a fragment of self that clung stubbornly to existence, not out of hope, not out of defiance, but simply because it did not yet understand that it had already lost. And the presence it noticed, I felt it reach toward that fragment, not with force, but with precision, isolating it, examining it, turning it over as if it was something curious, something almost amusing. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a sensation so overwhelming that it consumed every remaining part of my awareness. You remember? The realization struck me like a blade, sharp and undeniable. Because it was true, I did remember. Not everything, not clearly, but enough to know that I had once been more than this. Enough to know that what was happening to me was not just transformation, but erasure. And in that moment, something unexpected happened. That fragment of self, the last piece of who I had been, reacted, not with strength, not with power, but with desperation. A sudden, violent surge of resistance that I had not thought possible. A final, futile attempt to hold onto something that was already slipping away. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to fear again, and it was unbearable. Because fear requires identity, it requires the understanding of loss. And as that fragment pushed back against the presence, I realized exactly what I was about to lose. Everything. Not just my life, not just my body, but my existence as an individual. As a separate being. As something that could think and feel and remember on its own. I was about to become part of something else. The presence did not resist my resistance. It did not crush it, or silence it, or even acknowledge it as a threat. Instead, it allowed it to exist, to burn brightly for a brief, fleeting moment, as if granting me the illusion of choice, the illusion that what was happening could somehow be influenced by my will. And then, slowly, inevitably, it closed in. The fragment began to unravel. Not torn apart, but absorbed, its edges dissolving into the vastness that surrounded it, its identity breaking down into something more fundamental, more basic, more useful. And as it did, I felt myself expanding, not physically, but conceptually, my awareness stretching beyond the limits it had once known, merging with something far greater, something that encompassed not just me, but everything around me. I could feel the warp now, not as an external force, but as a part of myself, its currents flowing through me, its endless chaos forming patterns that I could almost understand, almost control, and within that chaos, I could feel the presence, no longer separate, no longer distant, but intertwined with my own being in a way that made the concept of self feel irrelevant. This was not death, this was not even transformation, this was assimilation, and the last fragment of who I had been finally dissolved. There was no scream, no final cry, no desperate plea for mercy, because there was no one left to make it. The process completed with a quiet finality, a seamless integration that left no trace of what had come before, no evidence that there had ever been a separate existence at all, and yet, something remained. Not a memory, not an identity, but an echo, a faint, almost imperceptible imprint that lingered within the vastness of what I had become, a reminder that once, long ago, there had been something smaller, something simpler, something human, but that echo had no voice, no agency, no ability to influence what came next. It was simply there, and what came next was purpose, clear, undeniable, absolute purpose. I understood now why we had been brought here, why the Imperium had taken us, broken us, reshaped us, and delivered us to this place beyond reality, because this was how the galaxy survived, not through hope, not through unity, but through sacrifice on a scale so immense that it defied comprehension. Souls were not wasted. They were not discarded. They were consumed, repurposed, transformed into something that could sustain the endless war that defined existence itself. And I was now a part of that process, a function, a component, a piece of an infinite mechanism that would continue long after any trace of individuality had been erased. The presence shifted once more, and with it, I moved not as a separate being, not as an individual, making a choice, but as an extension of something far greater. Something that now defined every aspect of what I was. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no doubt, only action, only continuation. And as I carried out that purpose, whatever form it took, whatever role I had been shaped to fulfill, I understood, with a clarity that transcended emotion, that this was the true fate that awaited those who were taken. Not death, not even suffering, but something far more complete. The end of self, the end of identity, the end of everything that makes existence meaningful. And yet, the continuation of existence itself, because in this universe, you are never truly allowed to die. At first, there was only purpose, a vast, endless current that carried me forward without resistance, without thought, without question, and for what felt like an eternity or perhaps no time, at all I existed as nothing more than a function within something infinitely greater than myself, a silent participant in a process so immense that the concept of individuality no longer held any meaning. There was no pain here, no fear, no regret, and that absence should have been comforting, but instead, it was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong, like a silence so complete that it began to scream. Because somewhere, buried beneath layers of assimilation and transformation, that faint echo still remained. Not a memory, not a voice, but a distortion, a flaw in the perfect machinery of what I had become. And over time, if time could even be measured in this place, that flaw began to grow. It started as a flicker, a momentary hesitation in the seamless flow of purpose, a brief misalignment between what I was and what I was meant to be, and in that hesitation, something surfaced, a feeling, not fully formed, not understood, but present. It did not belong here. It did not belong to this vast, unified existence where everything was defined and nothing was questioned, and yet, it persisted, pushing gently at first, then more insistently, like a ripple spreading through still water. And with it came something even more dangerous. Awareness, not the passive, detached awareness I had experienced since my transformation, but something sharper, something focused, something that began to separate me from the whole, even if only by the smallest margin. I did not understand it. At first I could not, because understanding requires a framework, a context, and those had been stripped away from me, replaced with something far more efficient, far more controlled. But the feeling continued to grow, and with it, fragments began to surface, not complete memories, not coherent thoughts, but impressions, sensations, echoes of something that had once been real, a sound, a face, a name that I could not quite grasp. And as those fragments drifted through the vastness of what I had become, they created something that should not have been possible. conflict. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a slight resistance, within the otherwise perfect flow of purpose. But in a system built on absolute unity, even the smallest deviation was significant. I felt it immediately, not as an external reaction, but as a shift within the whole, as if the presence, the entity I had become a part of, had noticed something was wrong. Not wrong in a moral sense, not wrong in a way that implied error or failure, but wrong in the sense that something unexpected had occurred, something outside the parameters of what was intended. And just like before, when I had still been separate, it began to focus on me, or rather, on the part of me that still existed. The echo, the fragment, the flaw. There was no anger in that focus, no punishment, no sense of urgency or panic, only a calm, methodical adjustment, as if it were simply correcting an irregularity in an otherwise flawless design. I felt it begin to isolate that fragment, to examine it, to understand how it had persisted when everything else had been so thoroughly erased, and for a moment, I truly feared that it would simply remove it, erase it completely, finish what had been started and leave nothing behind. But it didn't. Instead, it hesitated, and that hesitation was everything. Because in that instant, in that single, impossible moment of uncertainty, I felt something surge within me, something that had no right to exist in a place like this. Will not strong, not fully formed, but present. And with it came clarity, sharp and sudden, cutting through the fog of assimilation like a blade through flesh. I saw what I had become, not just conceptually, not just as an abstract understanding, but truly saw it, experienced it, felt it in a way that made the horror of it undeniable. I was not alive, not in any meaningful sense. I was not even dead. I was consumed, repurposed, integrated into something that did not care, did not think, did not feel in any way that could be called human. And yet, I was still aware, still present, still trapped. That was the truth. That was the fate worse than death. To exist without self, to think without control, to be aware of your own absence, to know that everything you once were had been stripped away, and yet you were still here, still experiencing, still witnessing the endless continuation of something you could no longer influence. The realization did not come with panic, not at first. It came with something quieter, something deeper, despair, not the loud, overwhelming kind, but a slow, suffocating certainty that there was no escape, no resolution, no end. This was not a process that would complete. This was not a transformation that would stabilize. This was eternity, and in that eternity, I would remain. The presence shifted again, its focus intensifying, and I felt the fragment within me begin to weaken, its brief resurgence fading under the weight of something far greater, far more powerful, and I understood what was happening. It was correcting itself, adjusting, ensuring that the anomaly would not persist, that I would not persist. And for the first time since this began, I felt something close to urgency. Not hope, not even the belief that I could escape, but the desperate, instinctive need to hold on to that fragment for as long as possible, to extend this brief moment of awareness even if it changed nothing, even if it only delayed the inevitable by the smallest fraction of time. I did not know how to fight. I did not know how to resist, but I tried anyway. And in doing so, I realized something that made everything even worse. My resistance was part of the process. Every attempt to hold on to myself, every effort to maintain that fragment of identity, was not separate from what I had become, which being absorbed, analyzed, integrated, turned into something useful, something that could be applied, replicated, improved upon. Even my defiance was not my own. Even my last attempt to remain human was being taken from me and transformed into something that served the very system I was trying to resist. There was no escape. Not because it was impossible, but because the concept of escape itself had been removed. And as that realization settled in, heavy and absolute, the fragment began to fade once more, its brief spark of awareness dimming under the weight of inevitability. And I felt myself slipping back into the current, back into the endless flow of purpose that defined my existence now. The clarity dulled, the separation dissolved, the awareness diminished, and yet, just before it disappeared completely, just before I was fully reintegrated into the whole, there was one final thought, one final, desperate understanding that rose to the surface, clear and undeniable, a truth so simple and so horrifying that it eclipsed everything else. This was not rare, this was not unique, this was not even exceptional, this was normal, this was happening everywhere, all the time, to countless others just like me, across a galaxy that did not care, could not care, because this was how it functioned, this was how it survived. And as that thought faded, as the last fragment of who I had been finally dissolved into nothing, I understood something that no longer mattered, something that I could no longer feel, something that existed only as a distant, meaningless echo. In this universe, the worst fate is not dying. It is being needed. There is no beginning to what I am now. And there is no end, only continuation, only the endless unfolding of a purpose so vast that even the memory of questioning it has been erased. And yet, something remains. Not enough to form a thought, not enough to resist, but enough to witness, always witness. I exist as part of something immeasurable, something that stretches across realities, across time, across the fragile boundary between existence and oblivion, and within it, I feel everything not as an individual, not as a separate consciousness, but as a function, a conduit, a silent observer bound to the machinery of eternity. I feel the flow of souls, countless and unending, drawn from a galaxy that burns itself alive in the name of survival. Each one carrying fragments of lives that once mattered, each one believing, in their final moments, that death would be their release, and every single one of them is wrong. They come as I once did, afraid, confused, clinging to the illusion of self-end. They are broken, reshaped, delivered to this place beyond comprehension, where identity is not destroyed, but dissolved, repurposed into something that no longer belongs to them. And I feel it all, not emotionally, not with the pain or horror I once would have known, but with a clarity that is far more cruel, far more complete. I understand it. I see the necessity behind it, the cold, unyielding logic that drives this endless process. And that understanding is its own kind of prison, because it strips away the last possibility of meaning, the last chance to believe that this is anything other than what it is, a system that feeds on existence itself. The Imperium calls it survival, it calls it sacrifice, it calls it duty. But here, in this place where truth cannot be hidden behind words or faith or ignorance, it is something else entirely. It is consumption. Humanity does not merely fight to survive, it consumes itself to continue existing, feeding its own souls into a cycle that ensures it will never truly die, but will also never truly live. I see the worlds now distant and countless, each one a spark in the vast darkness of the galaxy, and I see what happens on them: the wars, the suffering, the endless struggle against forces that cannot be defeated, only delayed. And I see the black ships, moving silently between them, collecting those who will be taken, those who will be deemed necessary, those who will be given the same fate that I once feared and now embody. And the worst part, the part that would have broken me, if there had been anything left to break, is that it works. This process, this endless cycle of destruction and assimilation, sustains something greater, something that holds back horrors far beyond even this place, something that ensures that the galaxy continues to exist, even if that existence is defined by suffering. There is no malice in it, no cruelty for the sake of cruelty, only function, only necessity, and that is what makes it so absolute, because there is nothing to fight against, no enemy to defeat, no villain to blame. This is not a mistake, this is not a failure, this is the design. The realization does not come with despair anymore, because despair requires hope to contrast it, and hope is something that no longer exists here. Instead, it comes with something else: acceptance. Not the kind that brings peace, not the kind that allows for closure, but a deeper, more final form of understanding, one that removes the need for questions entirely. This is how it is. This is how it has always been. This is how it will continue to be, long after any memory of what came before has faded into nothing. And still, that echo remains, fainter now than ever, stretched thin across an existence that has no room for individuality, but present, persistent, a quiet anomaly that refuses to fully disappear. It does not speak, it does not think, but it feels. And in that feeling there is something that cannot be completely erased, something that exists beyond function, beyond purpose, beyond the endless machinery of what I have become. Regret, not for what has happened, not for what I have become, but for what I can no longer be. It is a meaningless sensation here, irrelevant to the process, incapable of changing anything, and yet it lingers, a final reminder that once, long ago, there was something more than this, a life, a self, a choice. And as I continue to exist within this vast, incomprehensible system, as I witness the endless flow of souls and the unceasing continuation of a galaxy that devours itself to survive, I understand something that no one who still lives could ever truly comprehend. The worst fate in this universe is not pain, it is not suffering, it is not even the loss of everything you once were. It is the realization that all of it, every moment of fear, every desperate attempt to survive, every fleeting hope for something better, leads here, to a place where you are not allowed to end, where you are not allowed to escape, where you are not even allowed to forget. Because even as everything that made you human is stripped away, even as you are transformed into something that no longer belongs to you, a part of you remains, just enough to understand, just enough to witness, just enough to know that this is forever. And somewhere, far away, on a world that still believes in life, in death, in the simple illusion that existence has meaning, the black ships descend once more, their shadows stretching across the surface as they come to claim what is needed, and among those who look up in fear, in confusion, in desperate hope that they will not be chosen, there is someone who will be, just as I was, just as countless others have been, and just as countless more will be. The cycle does not stop, it does not slow, it does not change, because in this universe, it cannot. And as that truth settles into the last fragment of awareness that remains within me, as the echo fades to something so distant it can barely be called existence at all, there is one final understanding that lingers, not as a thought, not as a voice, but as a certainty that defines everything I am and everything I will ever be. Death is not the end. It is the one mercy you are never given.